Hi everyone, I am Madaleine Sorkin and I'm here with Yardeni, and we're here to talk to you about the Climbing Grief Fund and education related to grief and trauma and resilience. We really appreciate you joining us today and are excited to talk with you about these important topics. Sky, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I am the therapeutic director of the Climbing Grief Fund. I'm a social worker and mental health counselor here in the US and also in Israel. I first got introduced to the Climbing Grief Fund through my own loss, that I lost one of my best friends 2.5 years ago in a climbing accident. And through this work, it's been a big part of my own healing process, and feel really honored and privileged to be able to do this and share my perspectives, my views, my expertise, and just to be of support in our community.
Thank you, friend, for being a part of this movement. My name is Madaleine, as I said, and I have been an obsessed climber since I was a teenager, and in the professional athlete world and working as a guide. And I've experienced loss on a number of levels in climbing, farther out acquaintances, and closer in, and really continue to feel a need in our community for more resources to better deal with grief and trauma, and also for myself and my friends, just seeing us struggling with tragedies as they happened and having a lot of questions of how we can better equip ourselves and tap into the wisdom that is part of our community. And those questions really spurred me into the initial conversations of this program back in 2017. Two tragedies close to my heart occurred that fall, and conversations with the CEO, Phil Powers, at the American Alpine Club then have led me to beginning this program at the American Alpine Club. And Sky's really been involved since the beginning, helping us develop our programming. And so I thought I'd talk a bit about our mission and our program so far, and Sky will chime in too, also regarding where we're going in our future and looking forward to and building this community that we envision of more resourced individuals to deal with grief and trauma as it occurs in our community, in our daily lives, and in climbing. Really, the mission of the Climbing Grief Fund is to evolve the conversation around grief in our community and connect our community members, whoever those are, alpinists, ski mountaineers, climbers, but connect all of us to mental health resources that will help our individual paths for healing and doing our unique grief work. And that mission has informed our programming through and through, a philosophy that we all breathe in different ways, and that there's no one shoe fits all. We don't have a prescription for how to do this, but we do really encourage everyone to both do their work and support one another to do theirs, and learn how to do that better in our community. So I would say the backbone of our program is the Climbing Grief Grants. And let me take you onto our website. So as I was saying, the Climbing Grief Grants really were the initial vision of our program. And these grants began this year in 2020 after a lot of working group time with therapists and other individuals who have been really impacted by grief and loss related to climbing, alpinism, or ski mountaineering. And they offer financial support of $600 for individuals directly impacted by grief, loss, or trauma related to climbing, skiing, or alpinism. And so far, we've been able to award 15 in this year, and we're hoping to keep expanding how many we're able to offer each year. But that's been a concrete service that we are really happy to be able to offer, of both helping individuals financially, but also saying that, you know, we're with you on your process, and we believe it's important for you to engage in the landscape that is coming up for you as you have to navigate loss. Sky, did you have anything you want to add to the grief grant?
That they're open. It's an ongoing enrollment, and so people can apply whenever they feel fit. And yeah, that's about it. So it's just it's open. People can apply whenever, and we try to support also through financial support amongst other ways.
And the other part of our website that really ties into this grief grant and supporting individuals on their path with integrating grief and trauma is the mental health directory. And that is where, oh, it's loading. That is where we have a directory of therapists who've selected themselves to be allies for the Climbing Grief Fund, and often work with grant recipients to make that $600 grant go as far as possible, and then be listed as individuals who have some understanding of the climbing identity or the alpinism identity and are interested in working with our community. So you can see there's a number of different resources on this directory. One is that list of therapists that are organized by state, and will include what services they offer as well as what specialties they have. Their services can include individual therapy, or if they do tele services, such as working online, which is obviously relevant for 2020. And then specialties are everything from LGBTQ plus population to stress management or EMDR, trauma therapy, and general grief or depression.
I guess it's just worth mentioning that this list is out there for people to get connected with different mental health professionals. If someone is not a grant recipient, they can still contact and reach out to these therapists, and they're open to working with anyone. The reason that they're on that list is that they have some kind of orientation to the outdoor and mountain world. And
our directory is ever growing, is our intention with this, and it's really important for us to continue to be relevant in our community. So for example, this tab, books and other resources, these are some books and authors and psychoeducation resources that we're aware of that have been helpful for individuals managing their grief and loss. But if you have other ones to add, please let us know. In that vein, if you scroll down on the mental health directory, there's both an add a therapist and recommend a resource tab there. And it's worth mentioning as well that the climbing grief grants are not exclusively for therapy. You can choose a program that you want to work with your grief with, as long as there is some sort of grief or trauma framework in this professional program, those are totally valid approaches to working. And we have a few listed, and we're actively looking for more programs, but these are worth checking out. There's grief writing workshops happening regularly, and a yoga therapy workshop that happens with some regularity as well as intensive field experiences. And then the other piece that's been a mainstay of our program so far, we began last summer, is the Story Archive. And our Story Archive project is made up of mostly videos at this point, and these are filmed interviews with members of our community, some famous, some not famous, talking about their experience with grief and loss. And these are lightly edited, full interviews that are available on our website. And they've been made into a film called 1,000 Ways to Kiss the Ground. Some of these interviews really wanting to speak to the collective experience about grief and loss in that film. And I highly recommend you going and checking out that film, 1,000 Ways to Kiss the Ground, and then also seeing which of these interviews resonate with you. The intention of these interviews is to scratch beneath the surface with individuals and remind ourselves of the deeper narratives that we each live in, and hopefully some of them resonate and support you on your path to inviting this part of your lived experience in more. The other part of our programming that I wanted to mention is how we are building community, and that's through a couple realms. One has been our grief workshops, and Sky will be offering workshops similar to those during this Arc'teryx Academy. So I highly recommend you checking those out. This philosophy of better equipping ourselves for when grief or loss happen in our lives, and how to support our friends is such an essential thread, I think, that we can all be better resourced with. And the other piece is CGF Talks, which is another online resource that Sky has started offering. And let me just go down to where that is on our website. If you go to the home page, you can go to CGF Talks here, scroll down to the middle of the page, and these are webinars that Sky is doing and speaking with professionals in their field of expertise. They unpack issues related to grief and resilience in our sport. And the recordings after they occur happen on this website. Sky, is there anything you want to mention about those?
That the intention of these CGF talks is to create a conversation and dialogue, both like with the speakers who are leaders and professionals in our community, and also with the live audience around concepts and topics related to grief, because there's so much to talk about and there's so many different individual experiences, and our intention is to bring different voices, different perspectives, to both share experiences and also teach and highlight certain topics that maybe are not known. And so to just provide different I guess angles and perspectives on these different topics that both like in our community and also in the like professional literature, there's not a lot of content out there. And so it's been really helpful for folks to use these resources as they unpack certain aspects that aren't talked about very much.
Are there any talks coming up that you're really looking forward to, or anything you want to name of themes that we've covered so far?
Yeah, several. One is through these CGF talks, we really want to expand the concept of what grief is. Because the way that, from my biased lens of what grief is, my lived experience is death in the mountains in this context of the Climate Grief Fund. And what we really want to do is to expand that and to talk about loss and how loss can look very different for different people in different bodies. And so what loss is for me as a cis male, white passing person can look very different for someone with a different color skin, different ethnicity, different sexual orientation, and other social identities. So just like expand the concept of what grief and loss is and can look like. So that's something that I'm really excited to explore and expand and unpack with folks. Another thing that I'm really interested in is healing through climbing. Because in the context of the Climbing Grief Fund, we see climbing as a source of adversity or something that caused pain. And to also highlight the healing aspects and the parts of climbing that can help work through different loss and pain. So those are a few amongst many, many others that I'm really excited to unpack with folks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. That really ties into how we are working to continue to expand this conversation of grief. It's felt very important for Sky and I and a number of climbers to begin with the grief and loss related to climbing accidents and that acute form of loss. And there's so much other grief and trauma in our community to speak to, and where those intersections are, we really see as part of our work as well. And so I think being a small program, that's exciting for us because we can do that in all of our veins. We can do that with our mental health directory and what resources we're recommending. We can do that in our story archive project and who we're asking to share their story. And that's such a beautiful platform because really Sky and I's interviewers are speaking as little as possible and working on holding the space in a welcoming, safe way. And it's tremendous work for us, and I think a platform that we can offer to minority and underrepresented voices in our community as well. And then on a psychoeducation level, this is the only other part of our website that I haven't mentioned. That's another place that we're going to continue to expand how we are educating ourselves around grief and trauma. Right now, when you go on it, there's a number of things I think are a great starting point for our community, and Sky will touch on some of these themes in this introduction and then in his workshops more in depth than this page. But I recommend you going on there, reading it and getting acquainted with the language that we're using, and also watching the videos.
Yeah, I personally think that educating ourselves on what happens inside us is a big and important part of working through and healing grief and trauma, to like understand, okay, what is happening to me, what is happening inside me, what is happening around me, so I can see it differently, engage in it differently, also validate things that are going on inside. So I would also really recommend to use that as a resource to continue educating ourselves, each other, and so we can also support other people who are going through similar processes too.
Yeah, and the final thing I would say about our website is to go to the bottom of our homepage, and you can look at how to be an ally with the Climbing Grief Fund or with these topics not related directly to the Climbing Grief Fund. We have some ideas on there, and please feel free to to email us and reach out in that regard.
Yeah, thank you for that overview of the history and the story of the Climbing Grief Fund, and maybe like what the needs are and how we're attempting to fill those needs that we've seen, and the different projects and programs that are in place that we try to give out resources and support in whatever ways we can. And a part of that is also education and sharing like evidence-based research and different concepts of terminology that may or may not be familiar, and to just get ourselves acquainted with like what is out there in the field, what is going on inside us. And so Madaleine and I saw it important as a part of this like introduction to grief, and like a first, maybe like a basic view of what this is and what we're about and what we're talking about. And so we found it important to create some kind of common language. And so when we say grief, we would know what we're talking about. When we say trauma, we know what we're talking about. When we say resilience, we know what we're talking about. So we're just gonna offer and provide like a little dip from those worlds. Obviously, there's so much more to say. And this is, again, a basic introduction of what these topics are. So I'll start with grief. What is grief? Especially in our world, that word is thrown around a lot. And basically the way that we see it is the internal processes in response to a loss. And that loss can look like and be very different for different people. It can be death, but not necessarily. And what we're trying to do is also expand the conversation of grief beyond death and just to see loss in all its different forms. So that is basically grief and what it is. And mourning is the external processes of how we act on our grief. And so there are different mourning rituals, or different things that help process whatever's going on. And so that would be considered mourning. And so just like to separate and what is what. And the thing about grief and mourning is that, like Madaleine said, there's no one way of doing it. There's no prescribed right or wrong way. We do see it on a spectrum of maybe healthy and unhealthy or less healthy, and that we can talk about in another workshop. And it's such an individualized process. It comes from the impact of whatever loss on the person. It comes from culture. It comes from the resilience one has when faced with adversity, in this case, loss. And so it can look very different, and people have different styles and paces and coping mechanisms. And to understand that there's such a wide range of ways to engage in grief. And so there's no textbook, really. There's no, it's hard to look up like, what should I do now? Like, or what is happening to me here? And to just understand that we all have our own pace, and to be gentle with ourselves and try to let go of that judgment, because that's something that can creep up very easily, of like, I can't get out of bed for 5 days. Like, there has to be something wrong with me. And no, like, you are grieving, and this is how you are grieving now. And there's so many different things and ways that can manifest. And to just put it into that context, and the less judgment we can and more naming, and leaning in and to see it for what it is, and giving ourselves permission to be in it, can really help us move through and let the grief move through as well. I guess that's all I want to say about grief for now, as like a basic intro. Do you have anything else to add, Matt?
I think just encouraging you to take whatever your next step is in your exposure to and weigh in with grief. I think the more that I've engaged myself in this process, the more I just realize that this this is a question that I hold of, you know, have I grieved today, and what does that look like for me today? There are great books out there. There's so many different resources that it's really worth exploring what a way in will be for you into that conversation with yourself.
Yeah, a framework that's been really helpful for me, both as someone who is still going through grief and supports others, is the concept of intentionality. Kind of like what Madaleine said, have I grieved today? To not, to go back and forth between being a victim and like allowing, this happened to me. Yes, absolutely. And where is my agency? Where can I be intentional? Where can I invite movement? However that looks like. And so like to go back between the static, maybe being stuck away, and allowing ourselves to be in that, and then inviting in movement, inviting in agency, inviting in intentionality. How am I engaging in my grief? How am I, having a different relationship, that I'm not only a victim, I'm not only staying in a place of this happened to me, but I'm bringing movement, I'm engaging in it as well. So to try to see both, and when each of that is appropriate, and where you see yourself on that spectrum of healthy and unhealthy ways of coping, or ways of, yeah. I hope that was helpful for folks. There's so much literature and more to say, and encourage you to continue seeking out this education. There's much more to dig deep. So that's grief. And so when we talk about grief, that's more or less what we talk about. And we quickly wanted to transition into trauma. And that is also a very deep rabbit hole that we can go and get lost in very easily. And our basic introduction to trauma, or how we like to talk about it, is trauma happens anytime something threatening or stressful, that kind of situation that overwhelms my ability to cope or manage. So if something happens externally that my nervous system doesn't have the capacity to cope or manage, that's a traumatic experience. And then the trauma is the impact on me. So let's say there's an experience, let's say an earthquake. Okay, that can be, that's an external objective traumatic experience, and both Madaleine and I are there. That would be perceived differently. And that's our trauma. So there's a traumatic event, and then there's a trauma and the impact on each one individually. So it's really important to say that, kind of like grief, trauma is also perceived differently, although we can all be in the same event. And that's also based on our culture and our background, and our resilience, and so many other things. And so that's just important to understand the difference between the two. And then when our nervous system is on overload or overwhelmed and can't really cope, so what happens then? So our nervous system goes into a fight, flight, or freeze state. And this can be in an acute, like the here and now, something's happening to me, or I'm in a traumatic situation. And that can be my reaction. I can be either in fight, that I'm trying to fight it, and whatever that threat or stress is, I can flee, I can run away, or I can freeze and be catatonic. And that can be, again, my reaction in the acute stages, in the here and now, or it can be a reaction that is embedded in me, and that's how I also respond to other situations when it's less stressful or less threatening. And so it's important to understand also that we all have our different reactions, and there's no right or wrong. When any nervous system is in overload or overwhelmed, that is, those are the three default ways of reaction. And like I said, if my go-to is freeze, then most likely I will find myself in a freeze state in other situations when it's not as acute or dramatic, let's say. In the stages of trauma, there's, like I said, there's the acute stress disorder, where I'm in an overwhelmed state, and what happens to me in the here and now. There's a acute stress reaction of what happens to me in the first week, and then after 2 months, 2 or 3 months, there's something called PTSD, which a lot of people are familiar with, and I believe that might have a wrong concept of what it means, of post-traumatic stress disorder. And our friend Laura McLadry does an incredible job of depathologizing stress and trauma, and to see it as an injury, actually. And so what that means is, to have PTSD, you need to check certain boxes. But what if I check 4 out of the 6? Does that mean that I don't have trauma at all? So it sees stress and trauma as an injury, and says that we all have it, and it's a part of life, and we all have different exposure to different traumatic experiences from when we're very young all throughout our lives. And then how has that impacted our lives? And so that's a framework and a concept that we like to look at when talking about trauma and stress. Yeah, please.
Something. One is, those videos with Laura McGladry can be found on our psychoeducation site, and yeah, the stress injuries video is helpful for understanding that concept more. And there's a lot of resources around developing one's awareness of where you are on that spectrum. So yeah, that's an approach that we often do in this.
Yeah, totally. And just quickly, some of the reactions that people might find themselves in when having trauma or experiencing trauma can be 5. So these are like indicators of a, I guess, post-traumatic reaction to different stress or different stressors, let's say. So one is re-experiencing, which means that kind of like flashbacks. It's going back into the moment of when the traumatic event or their traumatic experience happened, and it's as if I'm back in that moment, and so I react the same. And it's a whole like somatic body experience of whatever that re-experiencing is. So that's one. A second is increased arousal, which means that if someone finds themselves very vigilant and just aroused, that can be in the body, and heightened pulse and blood pressure and breath, but also just like very aroused, very vigilant, very irritated, like easily irritated. That's another indicator of, or a reaction of stress. Third is avoidance. If I find myself avoiding the experience that caused the traumatic event, or avoiding experiences that can cause certain like similar emotions, or similar senses, or whatever can remind one of the traumatic event or experience. So an avoidance of that is also an indicator in a reaction of stress and trauma. Fourth is changes in belief and thoughts. So after a traumatic event, a lot of my perception of life can be changed and differed. There's a rupture in trust. So let's say I trusted, every time I go on, do you have something to say?
No, I was gonna say, you trusted me. I thought you were going hypothetical, so we can.
I was actually going on when I drive, and I trust my car. And suddenly my car malfunctions and it twists and goes to the other lane, and that can really rupture the way that I trust anything mechanical, and and so it just really shifts and changes my whole thought patterns and perspectives of life or certain things. In our case as climbers, it can be partnership, it can be the rock, it can be gear, and so something about that, the thought patterns and the cognitive process. So that's another rupture that can happen. The fifth and final indicator is heightened or strong emotions. And so after a traumatic event or traumatic experience, if one experiences very strong and heightened emotions, whatever emotion it is, that also might be an indicator that trauma is in the room, as we say in therapy. And it can help us like navigate, oh, okay, so this is what is happening. I can name it, I can understand it, I can maybe engage with it differently, validate it more, and not say, oh, I'm experiencing this thing and it's overwhelming me and it's like overcoming all of me. Just say, oh, okay, so this, to just put it in its place and then engage with it. So those are five indicators of trauma or different reactions after one might experience a traumatic event. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that piece. Do you have anything to add, Madeleine?
One main theme that comes to mind is how trauma lives in our bodies, and that's just such an important thing to remind our minds of when our minds are making it really complicated. That there's a slew of body-centered practices and work that a lot of trauma therapists are centered on that, on the body, and so that's just one educational piece of this, that just remembering our bodies. And thankfully we have, as climbers, a lot of experience working with our bodies, but that it might require a different way to be with our bodies than we're used to.
Yeah, totally. Because a lot of these things, people can get stuck in these reactions or these patterns. And usually the stuckness comes from not allowing them to move through and not giving them a lot of space. And so working with our bodies and allowing that flow, if I feel freeze or if I feel irritated or agitated or vigilant, or I'm experiencing these strong emotions that manifest in my body, to give them space to do whatever they need to do. That is also like a huge way to let these patterns, like to move forward from these patterns, basically. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah. So we covered grief. We dived in a bit about trauma, and I just want, before we move on to our last two concepts, I just wanted to say that these things happen in climbing. They're inherent in climbing to a lot of people, most people, and that's why Madeleine and I started the Climbing Grief Fund, to help give out resources to navigate these things better. And these happen to us as humans, and these are inherent to us as humans, and these are part of the human experience or the lived experience. And so to just validate and make space that these things happen, and we can't really avoid them. We can try to be prepared. And what we're trying to do is to give enough education, information, and resources to help people move through them when they already happen as well. So us learning about these things is not only supporting ourselves, but also supporting others when they experience these things, because we can't do this alone. And that's why in the Climbing Grief Fund, we create community, because we really believe that we're here to support each other, and we just can't do this alone. And so this is a big part of our values and philosophy, and what we're here to try to foster.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Sky. And it's a big part of our experimentation in developing this program and what's going to work and be relevant. Uh, from my personal perspective, we've lost a lot of those community spaces for grief. And so these workshops that we've been doing are one way that we're also trying to practice holding space for the difficult emotions that are present in all of us.
So the third concept that we wanted to talk about or introduce is what happens when grief and trauma come together. What happens when they intersect with each other? Because they can happen separately. There can be a loss without, I guess, a lot of trauma. There can be trauma without a loss, and they can come together. And so the tricky part about when grief and trauma come together is kind of like the inability to see clearly, because all of the lens are pretty murky, because there's so many things happening in the nervous system, there's so many things happening in the body that it can very easily overwhelm the whole system. And the first thing that is important to do is just to name and realize, okay, both of these are in the room now, and to say hi, I acknowledge you, and hi, I acknowledge you, and to try to separate them. And to in therapy in the mindfulness world, we say uncouple, because they really like to come together when they do come together. And it's really important to uncouple, to separate them, and to tend to each separately. What tends to happen is that trauma can actually bully grief, and because a traumatic experience can really overwhelm the system, it might not allow grief to manifest or take place or really come out. And so it's really important to tend to the trauma, however that can look like to you. There are many different ways to tend and work and engage with trauma. And that can start allowing grief to come up in whatever ways it will. And again, the more engaged we are in our grief process, the more we can acknowledge and to be intentional about moving through it, the more healthy process one can have. And again, that can only happen when we uncouple, we acknowledge, and we tend to each separately. And we see like when they want to come together. And yes, Madeleine, I love this.
Me too. I have a question.
Yes.
I mean, can you give an example of what trauma, bullying, grief might look like for
I can
everyone?
share from my own experience. So even though when my when Sela, my best friend, died, I wasn't there with him. That was still a traumatic experience because I know him so well, and I could very easily picture the whole scenario and situation. And so I was like in that re-experiencing what I mentioned before of an indicator of stress and trauma. Like I had all these flashbacks, and I put myself in as his belair. I put myself as him so many times, and um, these aren't thoughts that I actively think. These are imposed thoughts that are imposed on me, and so like I was so preoccupied with that I wasn't able to feel sad or feel longing, because I was just, my nervous system was so heightened because of the trauma, that it just like it wasn't able to sprout or to come out. Yeah, so that's one example.
Yeah, and it sounds like eventually naming what the trauma was doing was a step towards decoupling that.
Mm-hmm. Uncoupled, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. yeah, so I guess that's what we can say for now about the intersection of grief and trauma. And last thing that maybe we should have started with is we at the Climb Grief Fund, we see it as so essential to in the healing process in our lives as climbers and loving human beings is resilience and what that really means. Because a lot of people can see the other side of the coin of pain or trauma is health or wellness or resilience. And so how they come together, how it's like two sides of the same coin, basically. And so the way that resilience is defined is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity. So it's my toolkit of it's my toolkit. I don't know of what. It's my toolkit to that I pull out when something does happen. And if someone has enough things in their toolkit when faced with adversity, they can meet it, and the impact of that adversity or that trauma or that stressor can be less. Like the one, especially as a veteran myself, like the one tricky part about resilience that I see is too much resilience or too many things in my toolkit can also lead to indifference and apathy, and to not let things like even touch me, you know. So like actually the barrier between me and the world is so thick that people can see that as, oh, I'm resilient because nothing is penetrating, nothing is hurting me, so I'm resilient. And when we say resilient, what we're saying is that yes, there might be a barrier between myself and these external events. I might have a lot of things in my toolkit to help me cope and manage these stressful situations, and I'm still allowing them to impact me, because that's where vulnerability and healthy vulnerability comes in. And we also see vulnerability as one of our tools in our toolkit of resilience. We see that as a place of strength, and so as we face adversity and adapt to it well, that connects to our self-care and our well-being in certain systems that we have in place already. That help us when something does happen. So let's say I already have a community of friends, and so when something challenging or an adversity comes in, I already have that in place to lean on and to use as a resource. I already have these routines in my life that that are helpful for me in maintaining a certain level of well-being that's already in place. And so when something comes that helps me engage, or not engage, I guess like deal or cope with a certain stressful situations in a more healthy or like better way, I guess, for the lack of better words. Yeah.
I think I'll just add that I encourage viewers to come to your workshops. The first one will be focused on resilience. So that would be a great place to dive deeper with you on this subject.
So much to talk about, and especially like what role nature can play in fostering resilience, and like deepening our toolkit of resilience through nature. It's so fascinating, and there's so much potential there. So yeah, and that's what I'll be talking on my first workshop as well. So that's what we got for now. Just wanted to give an overview of what we did cover today. So Madaleine took us through an overview of the Climbing Grief Fund and our story and our mission and the different projects and programs that are in place, the psychoeducation and the mental health directory and the interviews of the Story Archive project and the Climbing Grief grants. And we talked a bit about the CGF talks and how we continue to try to expand the conversation and the concept of grief beyond death, and just to allow space for loss in people's different experience. And then we went on to share some psychoeducational pieces around grief and trauma and what happens when grief and trauma come together and they intersect, and what happens then. And we ended with sharing a bit about resilience and how we see or how we define resilience. And those are all such big or like integrated parts of the conversation in our common language that we create at the Climate Grief Fund. And our hope is that as a community of people who are so passionate about being outside, that how we can continue moving forward and allowing these conversations to continue to happen in our different spaces.
Yeah, we just want to thank everyone for tuning in and your interest and investment in this subject already. And we are available. Please reach out to us. And thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, take good care.